In this video, I'll share the entire story of how we converted this boring, empty field into a huge, beautiful wildlife pond. You will see the full process of how we built this stunning water feature from start to finish. And if you like to watch transformation videos, then stay till the end. When we revisit 11 months later, you will witness the mesmerising way of how Mother Nature has completely transformed this barren, new pond into a healthy, vibrant and thriving ecosystem. This project is taking place in a small village just behind the stunning South Downs based in West Sussex. We took a chance by starting this ambitious project in January in order to have the pond ready for the spring. So far, the gamble has paid off. There has been no rainfall, so the ground is very firm, which is ideal for the heavy machinery we will be using. We chose this field because it had a perfect natural slight slope, which means that we can use all the soil to build up the bank on the low side to match the level on the opposite higher bank. This means that we will not need to remove any soil off-site, which would have been extremely expensive, and the narrow lanes were far too small for all the heavy traffic. One of the nice things that I really like about large jobs like this, as long as you know what you're doing, you can actually use a small team and the correct machinery. For instance, to get things started we only needed one large digger and a dumper. Before we could get started on the main dig, we needed to move some of the newly planted trees that were smack bang in the middle of the new pond. This was no problem at all. The digger lifted them out with ease and we quickly replanted them in the field next door. Now that the small trees had been moved safely, we could focus mainly on digging out the new pond. The original pond dimensions were 40 metres by 20 metres with the island size of approximately 5 metres by 3. To get the perimeter marked out, we simply cut some cheap wooden battens into stakes, which were then hammered into the ground to our measurements. We then wrapped high-vis tape around some of the stakes to give us a much better visual on the pond shape, especially when we sent up the drone. Luckily we had access to a drone. Once it was sent up, we soon realised that the shape wasn't ideal and it looked far too narrow. We discussed in great depth and agreed that the pond was needed to be made bigger. The new pond dimensions were 45 metres by 25 and the island size 7 metres by 5 metres. We then used longer stakes around the far bank which needed to be raised up. We set up the laser levels and marked out the stakes. The level on the stakes was now the same height as the highest points on the opposite side of the pond. Now that we were finally happy with the dimensions and levels, it was time to start digging. Using the 8-ton digger, we were very anxious to find out what was lurking beneath the soil. From other ponds that we have built in the area, we have had problems with large sheets of limestone in the past. This would have been disastrous and plan B would need to be put into place. The first deep scoop was just lovely topsoil. In fact, each and every scoop thereafter was just the same, which was extremely good news. All the excavated soil was then moved carefully into position where we could begin the slow process of building up the bank. Once we had a good amount of soil on the bank, we used the excavator, all 8 tons of it, to compress the earth firmly into place. Annoyingly, every time we did it, the levels lowered more and more. However, remaining positive, it was simply providing additional strength the more compact the ground was. Problems are always expected, however, I wasn't actually expecting to break the digger. Luckily, we had some local help who soon had us back up and running in no time. With a good 7 days straight of digging, the pond was finally starting to take shape. The pond was getting deeper and deeper, which meant that the raised bank was getting higher and higher, which was ideal. As we planned on having the water approximately 1 foot below the lowest point of the pond, we needed to double check the levels. The laser level was brought out again, and so were our trusty stakes, which were hammered back into place. We remarked out the new levels so we knew exactly how much higher the raised bank needed to be. It wasn't too long after that we'd finally dug out the entire pond. We worked out that the average depth was about 5 foot deep and about 7 foot deep in the deepest. We also calculated that total water volume is over 300,000 gallons or 1.3 million litres. That's going to take a long time to fill. As we finally reached the correct levels, we could now start to focus on preparation for the extra large pond liner. When the pond is full of water, it is important that all the liner is completely hidden. So to achieve this look, we needed to build an anchor trench. The trench serves 2 important factors. It secures the liner into position when it's been backfilled, and it also provides a stunning natural planting shelf around the perimeter of the pond. Once the shelf's been completed, all we need to do is finish off grading the pond edges before we can send in the roller to smooth out the pond sides and base. If you haven't driven a roller before, I would highly recommend it. They aren't fast, but if you like squashing things, they are great fun. Not only does the finished result look awesome, it really does smooth out any track marks and sharp objects. I still can't believe how lucky we have been with the weather so far. It hasn't rained a drop. With the dry conditions, we also had another touch of luck. The delivery driver was happy to drop off the heavy pond liner right next to the pond. This just shows how dry the ground actually was. The next job on the list before the liner can be installed is that we needed to build an overflow system. With the larger digger swapped for the smaller model, we began digging a trench for the overflow pipework. Not only will the overflow prevent the pond from flooding, it will also enable us to fully control the water height, which I'll show you later on in the video. Any excess water will simply drain off into the neighbouring field. To build the overflow itself, we made simple concrete base with some basic blockwork and added two 3-inch connectors, which later would be sealed directly to the pond liner. These are very easy to install, it's just important to ensure that the pipework is level, which you'll see why later on in the video. With all the ground preparation finished, we are now ready to install the pond underlay. We always use a professional grade, heavy duty, non-rot and a root proof version. This is an absolute must. Not only does it protect the liner from sharp objects, it also helps prevent the liner from stretching. Adding the underlay is quite time consuming for a large pond like this, but it is important to get it right the first time as you only have one chance. We started with the top edge first, then working away from one side to the other, allowing for each roll to overlap slightly. When we were happy with each sheet, we pegged securely into place. Pegging is essential as it will help prevent movement when the liner is dragged over it. Also, it is also important to lay the underlay in the same direction as the pond liner when it's fitted. This again will stop the underlay from slipping when the liner is pulled over it. The next part of the job was something I was not looking forward to, and that was installing the pond liner. This liner weighs over 1.2 tonnes, so it's extremely heavy and difficult to move, especially once it's in if need be. Luckily, the digger was just man enough to move into position for us. Pond liners are rolled up in the factory, so you can simply lay them on one side of the pond and pull them across to the other. We could have used more people to move a liner of this size, but sometimes, as the saying goes, too many cooks can spoil the broth. This was a very laborious process, and after a few hours muscles were hurting all over, especially in our fingers and forearms. It took some time, but we finally got there. A total of 3 days of pulling and heaving did the job. But as expected, once the liner was in place, we needed to shift it again. It needed moving about 2 feet in the other direction, so the moving process started again. When we were happy with the position, before cutting it, we secured the sides and pulled out any more ripples and folds on the base. This also took some time, but it was well worth it in the end. The excess liner was cut off and we pegged the liner to the top of the anchor shaft all the way around the pond. Now that the liner is fully secured and cut, the next job is to connect the 2 overflows to the pond liner. First, we part filled the back of the overflow where the pipework diverts the excess water to the next field. Using the specialist connectors, we cut holes into the liner to seal directly to the flange. But that's not the only trick these connectors can do. We also welded in 2 overflow pipe extensions. The water level will never go higher than these pipes when cut correctly later in the video. With the overflows in place, it's full guns ahead to backfill the anchor shelf. This is always a great part of the job as you can really start to see the pond come together. We simply kept all the old spoil nearby and used the back of the digger bucket to compact the earth and to grade in a perfect slope. Unfortunately, all good things come to an end. The wet weather had finally arrived. It wasn't just a few showers, it was torrential. In fact, the heavy rain part-filled the pond to a point that it stopped us working for the next part of the job, so we needed to drain it. Now that enough water had been removed, it's back to work. We couldn't continue backfilling the anchor shelf as we needed a pre-plan for when we work on the island. Due to the sheer volume of earth needed to fill the island, a wheelbarrow simply wasn't going to cut it. So we needed to build a temporary bridge which would enable us to work efficiently when moving the saved spoil and our materials to the island. To do this, we laid down some underlay on top of the liner to give it some protection. We also enlisted the help of a smaller dumper, which again are great fun to ride. Then using the digger and dumper, we slowly built up the bridge. Now that we can easily access the island, it was time to install the island's retaining wall. Fortunately, the muddy conditions had certainly made a straightforward job much more difficult. The wall was vital to hold all the soil in place when we built up the island later on in the video. We used a simple 1-layer concrete blocks on a sturdy concrete base. When we built the island, we measured and added a small shelf to accommodate the blockwork, so when the pond is full, the blocks will be under the water and concealed by the plant life. Whilst the concrete cures on the island, we could start work on the jetty. As the liner was already installed, traditionally hammering the posts into the ground was not an option. Instead, we would install 2 supporting reinforced concrete bases with 4 supporting posts. Before installing the top concrete base, we measured that when the pond was full, there would be precisely a 10-inch gap between the top of the water and the bottom of the jetty. We added some basic framework and filled it with cement. This was fairly straightforward. However, the bottom base was much more challenging. Due to the size of the base, it needed a lot more cement. However, with the pond depth, we couldn't wheelbarrow the concrete to it. So instead, we built a concrete slide, which actually worked quite well. We also added steel supports throughout the base and also for the supporting posts. We used large PVC pressure pipe, which made installing much easier as we could handle it better and install it directly into the wet cement. Once the base had gone off, we lasered the top of the concrete base and marked out the posts. These were then cut so the base and the posts were perfectly level. As the posts had been cut, we filled the posts with cement and added the steel framework connections into the wet cement on top. Once the cement had gone off, it was time to install the framework. The wood that we were going to use is 6x2 C24 structural timber. We took our time and started off by squaring off the first section. Once the section was perfectly square, the rest was relatively straightforward. The wood was delivered pre-treated, however, we did an additional treatment as it was so close to the water's edge. This was for our own peace of mind. The entire framework was well secured to the concrete base and posts. Once all the diagonal battens were fixed, the frame was super strong and now ready for the main show. The wood we are using is a hardwood called yellow blau. This timber is not cheap, but it is needed when installed so close to water. Each piece was laid across the full width of the jetty, ensuring that there was a small overhang on each side. Leaving a suitable gap between each panel, the decking was secured via stainless steel fixings. Once it was all laid, I simply squared off both edges using a straight piece of timber and cut off the excess. Before I fixed the front and sides, I needed to paint the concrete base with a black epoxy resin paint. This was mainly for aesthetics. Then the final edges were secured to the decking. This wood is simply stunning and I love the natural colours, especially after I clean it off with water. This wood is going to need a season before it can be oiled, so we will do this later on in the video. To start filling the island, we laid loads of excess pond liner down to help protect the main membrane. Moving the soil onto the island was probably the most nerve-wracking parts of this job. However, with perfect handling, we were able to fill the island efficiently within the day. Our hard work with the temporary bridge had paid off and it was now time to remove it. We also installed a small duck house to the island with the hope to attract some of the local ducks. Additionally, 2 small trees were planted with root systems that will favour the soil depth and water nearby and to give some shade in the warmer months. We have had non-stop rain now, which is no problem as we are ready to fill up the pond. We have just a few more tidying up jobs to do before we can start planting, grassing and adding the wildflowers. Although we've had a good amount of rain in March, the pond is still taking its time to fill. It's April now and the weather's been rather dry. Luckily, the pond is also filling up from rainwater reserves from around the property. However, it's time to do some planting. With all the local shops now stocking pond plants, we bought a nice selection to start things off. We always plant native, non-invasive pond plants which not only look stunning, they are also very easy to manage. First, we added 5 large lilies with a selection of different coloured flowers which we placed around the pond. We then added 30 marginal plants and a mix of yellow and purple iris and marsh marigolds. We spread them across the island and different areas around the pond by planting them directly into the anchor shelf. Once the pond plants were in, the overflow was then cut to the desired level and the debris cages were added. We also cleaned and oiled the deck using a top oil brand. This was recommended to us to help preserve the colours and beauty of this amazing hardwood. Finally, the last job on the list before we can let the boss, Mother Nature, take over, we added a huge range of wildflower seeds and grass seeds which were then scattered on the island and around the pond perimeter. When we returned in July, we finally saw the pond full for the first time. It was great to see. Even though it's been a hot and dry summer up to now, there's excellent signs of growth on the island and around the pond. It's still fairly patchy, but it's only been 2 months since we were last here. However, when we revisit in November, which is coming up next in the video, I'm delighted to report that Mother Nature has well and truly made her mark.